Welcome to Audiobook da Morgan. Today's reading is Utz, chapters 34, 35, and 36. But before we start, please subscribe on my channel and press the button to activate notifications.
Chapter 34. On my way out, I thanked Marta for cooking supper. A wan smile passed across her face. Without getting off her stool, she inclined her torso stiffly from the waist. It was a very warm and sultry night, and moths were whirling round the street lamps. In Old Town Square, crowds of young people had congregated at the foot of the Jan Hus Memorial. They seemed fresh and full of vigour, the boys in white open-neck shirts, the girls in old-fashioned cotton dresses. The stars came out beyond the spires of the tin church, and, to peals of organ music, more people began to file through the arcades of the Divinity School, on their way back from Mass. Prague's spring was almost a year away, yet I remember an atmosphere of optimism. I remember being taken aback when Utz turned on me and bared his teeth. "I hate this city," he said. "Hate it? How can you hate it? You said it was a beautiful city." "I hate it. I hate it." "Things will get better," I said. "Things can only get better." "You are wrong. Things will never get better." He shook my hand and gave me a curt bow. "Good night, my young friend," he said. "Remember what I said. I will leave you now. I will go to the brothel." He was waiting to hustle me out of the bedroom. I was not to be hustled. I paused to admire an 18th century engraving of a fireworks display at the Swinger. I saw a photograph of Utz's father. I saw his illustrious decoration on its mount of black velvet. I saw a Venetian blackamoor bed table and, on it, a book by Schlitzler and one by Stefan Zweig. I saw a large container of talcum powder, or was it face powder, in front of the dressing mirror. I saw three other and unexpected items: a rosary, a crucifix, and a scapula of the Infant of Prague. The frilly lace lampshade had been singed by its electric light bulb. The flounced pink curtains and pink satin eiderdown, both of which had seen better days, gave the room an atmosphere of musty, rather coarse femininity. I looked at Utz afresh in the light of this discovery. I looked at his shiny scalp. Was there perhaps, hidden under the skirts of the dressing table, a wig? He was unable to look me in the eye. Instead, he tinkered with the gramophone and put on a record, a keyboard sonata by the Saxon court composer Jon Dismas Zelenka. The maid reappeared and laid two places on the glass-topped table, banging down the knives and forks with a show of bad temper. She turned her back and returned with a larger Meissen dish on which were arranged some pork chops, sauerkraut, and dumplings in gravy. Utz ate with dulled concentration, pausing now and then to mouth a little bread, sip a little wine, but scarcely saying a word. He blinked at me, apparently furious with himself for having invited this inquisitive foreigner who had disturbed his peace of mind and might, in the long run, cause trouble. He cringed whenever the maid showed her face. After helping himself to seconds, he began to relax. He had cut a cube of meat, impaled it, held it in the air, and addressed me pedantically. Each time I see a piece of pork on my fork, I must remind myself that pork and porcelain are the same word. "Really?" I said. "How's that?" "Really? You don't know it?" "Really not." "So I will explain." He reached for some of the shelves and handed me a small white cowrie shell, an ordinary specimen of Cripian moneta. Did its shape, by any chance, remind me of a pig? "Why not?" "Good," he said. "We agree on that one also." Cowries, he went on, were used as currency in Africa and Asia, where they were traded for ivory, gold, slaves, or other marketable commodities. Marco Polo called them porcelain shells, porcella. In Italian was the word for little sow. He let out a perfect hiccup, probably caused by the sauerkraut. "I apologise," he said. "Don't mention it." He then produced, as if from nowhere, a bottle of translucent white porcelain which dated from the epoch of Kubla Khan. He had bought it in Paris before the war. Wouldn't I agree that its glaze resembled that of a cowrie? I would. Thank you. His next exhibit was the photo of an almost identical bottle in the treasury of St. Mark's, an object which was said to have arrived in Venice in the bags of Marco Polo himself. So now you understand about pork and porcelain. I think so, I said. Chinese porcelain, he continued, was one of those legendary substances, like unicorn horn or alchemical gold, from which men hoped to drink the fountain of youth. A porcelain cup was said to crack or discolour if poison were poured into it. Marta cleared the table, served coffee, and opened a box of Carlsbad plums. Utz hiccuped again and bombarded me with a flood of questions. Had I been to China? Had I read the letters of Father Matthew Hitchell or Father Dzianjorskis? Description of porcelain manufacture. How serious really was my understanding of Chinese porcelain? Under the Sung, the Ming, the Qing. From the 17th century, he said, the emperors of China had made a colossal impact on the European imagination. They were thought to be very wise and to live to a very great age, dispensing arbitrarily impartial justice according to laws derived from earth and heaven. They drank from porcelain. They built pagodas of porcelain. The smooth and lustrous surface of porcelain corresponded to the smooth, unwrinkled surface of themselves. Porcelain was their material, as gold was the material of the Royal Soleil. And even today, Utz added flippantly, our Soviet friends are never too poor to pay for gilding. Then would you say, I interrupted, that your Augustus's porcelain mania was conditioned by legends of the Yellow Emperor? Say it? Of course I would say it. And not only kings love porcelain, philosophers also. Leibniz was crazy for porcelain. Leibniz, who had believed this world was the best of all possible worlds, believed that porcelain was its best material. The maid stood motionless in the hallway, fixing her employer with a hostile stare, as if requiring him to end the interview. He took no notice. Now, will you look, please, at these two little persons? These were a pair of identical statuettes of Augustus the Strong, wreathed as a Roman emperor and standing like Tweedledum and Tweedledee amid the Dresden ladies. They were not modelled with much sophistication, yet had the concentrated energy of an African fetish. One was made of red Botticher ware, the so-called Jasper porcelain. The other was white. Tell me, said Utz, what do you know about Botticher? Not much, I replied. He began as an alchemist and then invented porcelain. He may have invented porcelain, but even that is not for sure. I reached for my notebook. He reeled off a synopsis of Botticher's career.
Chapter 35. That winter I sent Utz a Christmas card and got a postcard in return of the tomb slab of Tycho Brahe, hoping that when I next returned to Prague I would call him. During the months that followed, as the world watched the activities of Comrade Dubček, I tried to imagine Utz's reaction to the events, wondering if he still stuck to his guns, that things would never, ever get better. As the summer wore on, despite noises in the Soviet press, it seemed less and less likely that Brezhnev would send in the tanks. But one night, as I drove into Paris, the Boulevard Saint-Germain was closed to traffic, and police with riot shields were pushing back a surge of demonstrators. The occupation of Czechoslovakia had been completed in a day.
I humped my bag up the stairs of the Hotel Louisiana and told myself sadly that Utz had been right. In December I sent another Christmas card. I never had an answer. Dr. Orlik, on the other hand, was a positive nuisance, always in a semi-legible scrawl, always on the notepaper of the National Museum. He pestered me for photostats of scientific articles. He commanded me to trace the whereabouts of some mammoth bones in the Natural History Museum. He demanded books, nothing cheap of course, usually monographs, published at great expense by American university presses. One letter informed me of his current project, a study of the housefly, Musca domestica, as painted in Dutch and Flemish still lifes of the 17th century. My role in this enterprise was to examine every photograph of paintings by Bouchard, von Huysum or Van Kessel, and check whether or not there was a fly in them. I did not reply. About 6 years later, towards the end of March 1974, I received from Orlik a black bordered card on which he had scrawled, "Our beloved friend Utz is dead." The word beloved seemed a bit strong, considering I had known Utz for a total of 9¼ hours, some 6½ years earlier. All the same, remembering how devoted the two friends were, I sent a short note thanking Orlik for the news and hoping to share his sorrow. This produced a flood of even more unreasonable demands. Would I send $1,000 US to help the researches of a poor scholar? Would I agree to sponsor a 6-month tour of Western scientific institutions? Would I send 40 pairs of socks? I sent 4 pairs. The correspondence dried up. That is the end of chapter 35. Homesick, yet hadn't given a thought for the porcelains. He could only think of Marta alone in the apartment. That concludes chapter 23. Chapter 36. At the end of last summer, I happened to pass through Prague on my way back from the Soviet Union. The mood, especially in smaller cities along the Volga and Don, struck me as exceptionally buoyant. The Soviet education system, I felt, had worked all too well, having created, on a colossal scale, a generation of highly intelligent, highly literate young people who were more or less immune to the totalitarian message. Prague was infinitely more mournful and gloomy. There were plenty of things in the shops, but the shoppers mooched up and down Wenceslas Square with the faces of a people disgusted with itself for having, if temporarily, lost hope. The works of the Prague Deutsch Schriftsteller Franz Kafka were unavailable in the bookstores. Monuments, likely to be the focus of national sentiment, the Tyne Church or St. Vitus Cathedral, were closed for reconstruction. Their facades had vanished under a blight of rusty scaffolding, although very few workmen could be seen. It was impossible to drive anywhere without being blocked up by a road sign. The entire city, Labyrinthian at the best of times, had been turned into a labyrinth of cul-de-sacs. I had the impression of a mercantile city in mourning, not so much for its loss of prosperity as the loss of its European role. It was a city at the end of its tether. I am being unfair. Everywhere in Prague there were signs that the Czechs were uncrushable. I think it was Utz who first convinced me that history is always our guide for the future and always full of capricious surprises. The future itself is a dead land because it does not yet exist. When a Czech writer wishes to comment on the plight of his country, one way open to him is to use the 15th century Hussite rebellion as a metaphor. I found in a Prague museum this text describing the Hussite's defeat of the German knights. At midnight, all of a sudden, frightened shouting was heard in the very centre of the large forces of Edom, who had put up their tents along 3 miles near the town of Zatek in Bohemia, in the distance of 10 miles from Cheb, and all of them fled from the sword, driven out by the voice of fallen leaves only, and not pursued by any man. As I scribbled this in my notebook, I seemed to hear again Utz's nasal whisper, "They listen, 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 listen to everything, but they hear nothing." He had, as usual, been right. Tyranny sets up its own echo chamber, a void where confused signals buzz about at random, where a murmur or innuendo causes panic. So in the end, the machinery of repression is more likely to vanish, not with war or revolution, but with a puff or the voice of a fallen leaf. End of chapter 36.
Não é de importância tão visível e manifesta que baste para garantir a vitória, incitando-o a tomar a iniciativa da guerra.